Good morning, everybody. My name is Simon Nicholas. I'm a partner here at KPMG Isle of Man, and welcome back to week 2 of our Preparing for a New Reality series. As usual, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So if there are any questions as we go through, please do feel free to email them to webinars@kpmg.co.im with the subject of question, or pop a question into the chat box on the right-hand side. And a reminder for those who've not seen this before, if you can't see it, there's 3 red dots on the right hand side that should bring that up for you. Should you lose us during the webcast, please do connect the reconnect button or click the reconnect button and you will be able to rejoin us. Just a reminder, the slides and the replay of today's session will be available from this afternoon on our webinars portal on kpmg.co.im. So I hope you had a good week. Certainly the island returned back around to all the pubs in the quay over the weekend with a bit more freedom. And for many here on the island, Monday was a milestone as kids returned to school, and a number of businesses have now come back into the office for the first time in 3 months. Certainly the traffic coming into Douglas certainly felt pretty normal to me this morning, moving at no more than 20 miles an hour. So some things haven't changed. Here at KPMG, we've opened our Athol Street doors, and our staff currently have the option as to whether they want to return to the office or stay working at home as we continue our staged return back to some form of normality. I'm joined in the room today with David Parsons, a tax partner, and Bryan Beesley, who leads our cyber and privacy team, and I'll speak to them throughout this. But Bryan, actually, just before we get started, throughout lockdown, we've seen a number of cyber and phishing attacks on the island, and notably a CSP last week. Any thoughts on what businesses should be thinking about from a cyber perspective as businesses return to the office?
Simon, good morning. Thank you. That's a very pertinent question at this present moment in time. Business returning and the change of what was the normality is quite critical. Lots of staff have been working at home on deployed assets outside of the normal network, and especially IT security teams. What I would suggest the key things now in the coming weeks is for the IT security teams to undertake significant activity to do a full and detailed patching and vulnerability scan on their networks. That's both their internal networks and those that are now outside their normal digital domain. And with that, look at what the patches state is, what it needs to be, because about 80% of most of the problems are fixed by patches and vulnerability updates. Lots of staff have been using their own personal digital devices to do their work and taking lots of documents and digital media home. What you need to now consider is understanding what data and information you've got at your staff's home addresses and in what form, what you're going to do about it, where it is, and how you're going to get it back and know that everything is back. So a proper data sanitization of employees' workplaces, their new workplaces / home, and also looking at the devices they've been using. If they're bringing them back, you need to clean them, make them clear, and get back to normality in a staged process. Many businesses like ours are letting employees work from home for an extended period. So looking at the InfoSec policies internally, business continuity, disaster recovery plans to allow for a mishmash of staff at home, staff in the new workplace, and dispersed staff in your workplace needs to be considered as well. It's also a really good time for InfoSec teams and risk managers and so on to look at the data holdings within the firm and look at what data losses may have been missed by going through the data loss prevention tools and protection tools, and seeing what is in the logs of what data traffic has been happening over the period of time. But the key thing is making sure your staff are able to work safely and securely whilst maintaining business objectives. So those would be some of my key things.
No, great, thank you. And for those, I guess, who are probably don't do so much IT speak, when we talk about patches, we're talking about essentially running updates on software, security software, and obviously Microsoft and the other key platforms, right?
Yeah.
No, that's brilliant. And thank you very much for that, Bryan. It's very helpful. Certainly, we are aware of some of our clients and businesses on the island that have done quite a lot of workarounds, and now it's a case of making sure that you fully understand all the impacts of those workarounds, right?
Totally. I mean, most companies and entities have a business continuity and disaster recovery plan and a program of work and a schedule. that would have been tested over the COVID period. And this is a prime opportunity for businesses to look at those plans and their processes and get the lessons from that and use the learning from experience process to actually revise them and develop them, make them more efficient, because they now have tested them. If they haven't tested them, then maybe they need to look at what they've actually got and see its applicability in the modern day. Because people are still vulnerable, especially senior executives. Phishing has been up, as you mentioned, and the ability to do attacks on staff and personnel who are deployed away from a normal office in a hectic environment at home. This is the time to now look back over the last few months and see if any phishing attacks have occurred that you don't quite know yet. It's a good opportunity to review prior activity. And
presumably that's something that businesses can't put off, because who knows what might happen, and when the borders reopen, or the UK is talking about preparing for phase 2, and we've seen that in Asia in particular with Beijing and Shanghai going back into lockdown. So presumably you can't put that off to a project next year when it's less hectic.
No, I would suggest not putting it off at all. Strike whilst the iron's hot. The potential within data loss, there could have been the data loss continuously going on for the last few months that's so low level it wouldn't pick up on your normal log system. But the ramifications over a year, 18 months before you actually do that review could be financially crippling.
Great. All right. Thanks very much, Bryan. So on with the agenda. So today, following my overview last week with regards to KPMG's global framework, I just want to touch briefly on some thoughts around adapting to new ways of working within the new reality framework. Today, as economists and stock market analysts and investors all hold their breath, waiting and watching to see the extent that retailers will be paying their rents today, which are all due on the 24th, it's only fitting to focus this week on real estate. We're joined by 3 fantastic guests: Deborah Watt, Head of Real Estate Investment at Neo Capital, formerly of Knight Frank; Mark Grace of Black Grace Cowley; and Ciaran Doherty of Tevir Group. A quick reminder then of KPMG's sort of the 4 R's as it's become known, is really to touch on where is a business in its evolution through the pandemic, and ultimately what adjustments is it making to its business practices to deal with ultimately this new reality. So reaction, that was very much early stages. That was, imagine, the early sort of firefighting stages. Resilience was really then building some of those processes and managing that uncertainty, and certainly there's plenty of that still going on today. Recovery is very much around assessing the damage, repairing that damage, but also redesigning some new processes, new ways of working, and new ways of adjusting to new consumer behavior. All of this then, once you've designed that and put that into practice, you're into the new reality. We saw from the poll last week that almost 75% of our listeners were either in new reality or in the recovery stage. So we're just going to look at some ways to support you in resetting and identifying opportunities to aid that shift from recovery to new reality. And we will actually do a follow-up poll this week. As organizations adopt new ways of working required for that new reality, unprecedented change is the new norm. And haven't we heard that before? And the next disruption may just be around that corner, I guess, touching on that wave 2 that certainly has been seen in Asia. To remain relevant, organizations need to maintain an iterative process to workforce shaping, to best position themselves to thrive in response to external factors, and to empower the business to explore scenarios for new reality. And I think it is certainly an exploration. No one has all the answers or a good enough crystal ball to accurately predict what that new reality is going to be. So I just wanted to pick up on 3 themes in particular that we're seeing. KPMG are not alone as a business that's continuing the existing flexible arrangements, at least until the 1st of September, which is our approach. If nothing else, that allows businesses to buy some time to work out how they are going to adjust. KPMG did an internal survey recently with all of our staff, and we had only 12 of our staff, and I think the payroll count was about 115 at the time, actually wanted to come back to the office on a full-time basis. Now, if that's representative of the Isle of Man as a whole, then a lot of businesses have got a lot of thinking to do, and clearly that's going to impact real estate. And I'm sure Mark and Ciaran will pick up on that in their slot around local real estate issues. So I think I'll focus on working patterns. Every business needs to be agile, and I think we've learned that through COVID. Both employers and employees, of course, are seeing the benefits of greater flexibility. And in some sectors, as we talked about last week, in fact, actually, there is some really positive impact on productivity. In a recent survey we did, external to the firm, 27% of people on the island that responded, this is more of a household type survey, said that they didn't enjoy working from home. Well, therefore, the vast majority do actually either are relatively neutral, sitting on the fence, haven't decided yet, or indeed do enjoy working from home. So there's no doubt that businesses will have to adapt. They'll have to adapt their technology, being very mindful of what Bryan's just talked about, but also adopt some new and enhanced skills and new ways of working for leaders and employees to ensure that they can be as flexible and nimble as possible. And then automation, we've seen the wide adoption of video technology in most businesses. And I think nearly every business that we've spoken to throughout the last few months have all said that from a technology standpoint, they are way more advanced than they were a year ago. Now, for some of them, that's starting from a small base. And for some of them, that's small tweaks around the edges. Certainly from a KPMG perspective, we've been working remotely at client sites for years, decades. But the reality is, and our technology has been built around that, but for many businesses, they didn't have that luxury and they have really adapted quite quickly. But of course, the video technology is not really automation as such. That's just a different delivery method. The acceleration of automation will see an impact on most, if not all, roles, requiring a bit of a rethink around existing organizational structures, the roles and way everyone works together. And certainly digitization will be just as important as talent going forward. Within this, there's a real shift towards a digital mindset, which optimizes those benefits of technology, and a reduction in the time spent on transactional tasks. Certainly over the past 5 years, I know KPMG have been talking quite openly about how they see the future of labor markets, and it's the role of automation is not to take away roles, it's to actually do those menial tasks, those repetitive tasks, and actually have staff members upskilled, and they can do the really difficult tasks and the true analysis and add value, which is potentially a better experience for the employee than in the past. And then the last one I'll really touch on is leaders. Certainly I know as a leader of this firm, I've had to adapt and change the way I do things. Pre-COVID, my office door was probably a bit like Piccadilly Circus. If you can imagine a delicatessen counter with everyone taking a ticket and queuing outdoor, trying to reach me to ask questions. Simply that wasn't possible during COVID. And there's only so much time you can spend on Microsoft Teams calls or Zoom calls. So there's been a real challenge over the last few months around how to connect with each member of my team, because I'm not simply seeing them every day and bumping into them in the corridors and socializing with them to get a feel for how stressed they are, how they're managing, and what their workloads are. So I think leaders need to remain really flexible going forward and adapt their style to the new ways of working, and don't assume the ways of working will adapt to the leaders' styles. But let's move on to the poll this week and check in where we think businesses are. David, any predictions from you?
Morning, Simon. I guess it wouldn't be a surprise that given the sort of opening up of schools, the opening up of bars and all the rest of it in the Isle of Man, a general move towards the right on our chart might be predicted here. Yeah, it's interesting. The results last week weren't that different to the UK results, which you'd argue we're in a much better position than the UK is on the whole. So yeah, it'd be interesting this week to see where it's at. I'll just give it a couple of minutes to let the results come in. So that's really interesting, actually. The results are still slightly moving around, but actually broadly the same.
I think that probably is a little bit of a surprise to me, I must admit. I thought businesses would be a little bit more confident about where they are, given that the reduction in restrictions over the last week. Either that, or we're doing a great job in educating the business community on which stage they're at. We're now going to hear from our first guest, Deborah Watt, who discusses with my fellow markets colleague, Tim Shawcross, the international real estate investment market. Over to you, Deborah.
So thank you, Simon. I'm really pleased to be joined by Deborah Watt of Neo Capital. For those who don't know Deborah, she is head of real estate investments at Neo Capital, having previously been a partner at Knight Frank. She's responsible for acquiring and advising on a significant number of real estate transactions in the UK, Europe, and the US. So welcome, Deborah. Thank you very much for your time this morning. So 2019 was dominated by uncertainty surrounding Brexit, and I know a lot of deals and transactions were put on hold. Following the December election and then finally leaving the EU on the 31st of January, the world begins to go into lockdown only a few weeks later with the outbreak of COVID-19. So what appears to be a continual uncertainty, possibly even as far back as the Brexit vote, what is the current state and the confidence of the real estate investment market and the impact this has had on inward investments?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think going back to your sort of 4 Rs, I think the first bit was really the kind of response to the crisis. So, you know, certainly from our investment perspective, and I think from many of our peers, we were focusing on managing the existing portfolio and some of the issues that have come up with that. So trying from an investment point of view to maintain a robust cash flow, but also equally trying to support tenants who need some help through these, you know, sort of 3 months. So that it's kind of been a sort of a reaction to the crisis. I think now as we're coming out of it, we are starting to pull together a lot more research about markets in Europe and also in the US. And whilst we have capital to deploy, I think we're probably in a holding pattern at the moment. And I think we will be looking probably more towards the end of this year in Q1 of 2021 to actually deploy that capital. So we're in a kind of a managing existing portfolio, seeing that through and pulling together our research and sort of updating our investment strategy.
Yeah, and we're reading a lot in the media about the potential, the V, the U, the double-shaped recovery to the economy. So what are you expecting similar within the real estate market?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think like everything, it's going to depend very much on whether we get second waves and how severe or not they are in different countries. And I guess if you start getting second waves and lockdowns, you might be more in a W. Hopefully with the sort of tracking, testing and isolating, if that can be managed, then I suspect it's going to be more of a U-shaped recovery, probably, if businesses can continue without interruption.
Yeah. So having seen how successful working from home has been and the ability to operate remotely, how do you see that potential shift in working patterns affecting affecting the market? And I suppose what I mean by that in terms of, will you see, I suppose, developments now being, I suppose, amended slightly? Will there be as much interest in that commercial? Will there be a rebasing of returns?
I mean, I think it's been a global experiment, really, hasn't it? This sort of home working, and I think probably a lot of people, maybe the more traditionalists, have been maybe quite nicely surprised at how well it can work. But I think that people still, you know, people are social animals. They want to interact. They want to collaborate with their teams. So I think you know, everyone talks about, is it the death of the office? I don't think it is. But I think that the way we work is going to be impacted. What we're looking at is thinking this might have some positive impact on some of the regional areas, particularly in the UK. So obviously the UK very London centric, but maybe this might be an opportunity for more regional working, regional hub offices, which might also allow people a little bit more flexibility on where they live. If we think that maybe not everyone has to commute in sort of 5 days a week. And I think in terms of investing in buildings, it's always been part of our strategy to look at the kind of the well rating of buildings and look at the environmental impacts. And I think to make sure that you're managing a robust building that can fit around new health and safety regulations, I think all of those types of things are going to become a lot more important when you're assessing value and when you're doing due diligence.
Yeah. And then just finally, our whole series is about preparing for the new reality. So what does the new reality mean for you and your industry?
I think, just going back to the point we've discussed, I think when looking at particularly office investments, we're going to be looking very carefully at how robust they can be and how fit for purpose they are for the new working reality. I think as well that obviously international travel is very much impacted at the moment, and as an international investor, so in Europe and the US, that's a bit of an issue. When you're buying property, you want to go and see it. I think there will be less business international travel, but I think the travel that is undertaken might actually have more value to it, because you probably won't be sending over 10 people to a conference in wherever, but when you go, it'll be very important about building your relationships and looking at assets. And kind of following on from that, I think that having strong partnerships in local markets or having representative offices or a network is going to be pretty vital as well. I think you want boots on the ground at the moment to really understand what's happening in these local markets.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning, and we're just going to head now back to Simon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim and Deborah, for that. I mean, Deborah's obviously touched very much on inward investment. I mean, David, just bring you back in for a quick question really around sort of inward investment for the Isle of Man. I mean, historically, structuring property through an Isle of Man SPV has been advantageous with investors, I guess I particularly say historically, but with following, I guess, a whole raft of changes, is there really still an advantage for structuring through the Isle of Man with real estate property? And what should investors and advisors consider from a tax perspective?
Yes, so if you're looking at sort of non-UK investors going into UK real estate, then it's fair to say that over the last sort of 5 or so years, the advantages of the Isle of Man and other offshore have been eroded or almost completely eliminated. And in particular for sort of both commercial and residential property, both capital gains and development profits will be taxed in the UK, whether you do that through UK vehicles or non-UK vehicles, where it's a non-resident behind the activity. So in many cases, the answer you get to really as to how to structure it is that it's neutral as to whether you say an Isle of Man SPV or a UK SPV, and you see people making decisions that are not necessarily based on tax driven, and it may just be a preference. Some people have a preference for using one or the other. There's a few sort of notable exceptions, in particular if you've got a foreign investor, a natural person, or say a trust going into UK commercial property. They're not going to directly want to own shares in a UK SPV from an inheritance tax perspective. So they'll either want to go through a non-UK vehicle, say an Isle of Man company, or hold the shares in a UK SPV through an Isle of Man company. And equally, if you're going into UK residential property for not for third-party letting, then, as has been the case for many years now, you need to watch out for the annual tax on enveloped dwellings, the ATED, and in that case, you typically wouldn't want to hold through a company at all, and that's been the position for some time now. But the sort of inheritance tax advantages that used to exist there are now gone since 2017 for residential property. So there's still situations where there's advantages, and in situations where there aren't advantages of using an Isle of Man SPV, you tend to be in a neutral position, but it's certainly not as good as it was some years ago.
Not as good as the old days.
Indeed.
Okay, I mean, let's turn our attention to the local environment then, and I'll pass over to Ed Horton, who leads our real estate team, and he can interview Mark and Ciaran. Ed, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Good morning. I'm Ed Horton from KPMG with responsibility for the real estate sector on the island, and I'm joined by Mark Grace from Grace Cowley and Ciaran Doherty from Tevir Group. And following on from what we've just heard from Deborah, we'll discuss with Mark and Ciaran their perspectives. What do you think has been the biggest impact or reaction by local property sector participants so far? And in this context, perhaps, how is transactional activity holding up? And perhaps, Mark, what confidence do you have in the immediate pipeline?
It's interesting, Ed. Obviously, it's still early days. We've gone from a situation when, from our perspective, half our market disappeared overnight, so the transactional market disappeared altogether. We still had deals coming through which had been agreed beforehand, but obviously nothing really new was happening for 3 months. If you took the resi market to start with rather than the commercial, and on the resi market, we'd probably reached a point just at lockdown where the market was as busy as it's been for 10 years plus, maybe 15 years, which was really good to see. Obviously, the legs taken from under it on lockdown. As it's reopened, and we're obviously ahead of the game relative to the UK, remarkable amount of pent-up demand has come through, which is fantastic. I think that it will last for a little while, but it won't last forever, and then it'll get back to a sort of a more stable situation. But the market in general strong, right through the price brackets, which is surprising, even up to sort of the multi-million type property, which we haven't seen for many years on the Isle of Man. So quite a positive outlook on the residential side. If anything, the agents now, I mean, obviously there's many agents out there. There seems to be a few arriving every few weeks. But at the end of the day, the agents over the next 12 months, I think, will struggle for stock, which is an unusual situation, possibly quite different to what you'll see in the UK. So quite a positive outlook on the residential side. On the commercial side, probably a little too early to know what's going to happen at the moment, just because a number of firms haven't even come back. I mean, Black-Graced Cowley's first day in is today in terms of having a full complement of staff, which is great, and they're already positive about being back. But so many of the companies here are either nationally driven or internationally driven, and head office hasn't yet approved full opening. So I think even yourselves here aren't full back to a full complement. So I think that it will be some time before we really see how the commercial market's going to come back, and different sectors will react differently. I'm sure we'll get into more detail as we go along. But, you know, the retail sector is going to be very different to the office sector, which is going to be different again to the leisure sector. So interesting times.
And Ciaran, from your perspective, is it a case of business as usual, press and pause, or out there looking for opportunities?
I think we've been back in the office probably for a couple of weeks now, and I think in terms of the sort of the timing of this is to, you say that sort of from say 25th of March when the borders closed, and if you like, shortly after that everybody start working from home. It as an organisation, the timing worked relatively well for us, just in terms of we got a few things tied up beforehand, and actually during the period that we've been locked down, we were in a very favourable position. That meant that we could sit down, sort of reflect on our last couple of years, if you like, last year, get all of the housekeeping, all your financial, your year-end accounts, all that kind of thing up to date, and all that good stuff, get your cash flows and everything in order. So now that we've come back to the office, it sort of feels as if
time to look forwards.
Yeah, very much, and sort of hit the ground running, if you like. So we're out sort of there looking for opportunities. The impact, the ongoing impact in terms of how we can sort of translate those opportunities and get them over the line is going to be difficult, particularly where they're something off island. But I think overall, we're back, and we're pretty optimistic.
And what changes perhaps do you see over the next sort of 12 months or so? And you just touched on it then with the borders being closed, at least for now. How do you think those sort of environment will evolve, I suppose, over the next sort of 12, 18 months?
Well, again, looking at the different sort of markets, I think that the main barometers over here are often the residential and the office market. So the residential, it's remarkable how much interest we have from off the island, which is a real positive. This is an island that I think desperately needs additional population to stem, which is a decreasing population at the moment, and to service the service sector, the businesses that operate here, the retail sector, and the more people is key to it. And I think that inquiries are strong at the moment. I just hope that they continue through, and we see some actual feet on the ground. Commercially, as I say, it's still taking a while to open up. But again, there's a job to do, I think, in terms of attracting new business to the island, outside of the traditional sectors we have. The traditional sectors we need to nurture, and sometimes they're the forgotten parties when people are always looking at new areas of business. But there's never been a better time to market the Isle of Man.
What opportunities do you think there might be for the island, and perhaps what barriers might exist? For example, maybe planning and development sort of opportunities or requirements, and maybe the ability to be able to move quickly through those types of processes. How do you see that maybe impacting on the availability or attractiveness of sort of assets that?
I think the market in terms of availability will follow demand as it normally does. This is a commercial marketplace. I think that there was a comment by the Chief Minister, I think last week, which said that there has been unprecedented interest in the Isle of Man over recent weeks. What I want to see is the government taking advantage of that and not. I think the worst case scenario at the moment is that we see budgets being slashed, Department of Enterprise being unable to go out and market. This is the time when the Isle of Man has to go and sell itself.
And really facilitate that opportunity.
Absolutely. And I'm less of a fan of the targeted marketing to say we need to go after the certain sector, be it gaming or anything else. I'm in favour of a little bit more of a scattergun approach. If you make the island look like an attractive place and bring people over, then let them bring their families and their businesses with them and see what naturally comes. And I think we'll see new industries coming. At the moment we have one industry that I'm dealing with, which is medicinal cannabis. Sure. Really exciting business. It could take potentially the largest warehouse letting ever on the Isle of Man. Yeah. It could be in place within 12 months. It could employ 40 to 50 people quite quickly, and it's a new exciting business that will be great, I think, for the Isle of Man to sort of shout, look what we've got. And there's things like that, but I think that scattergun approach and see what comes out of it is the best way to do it, but it has to be funded and it has to be driven by central government.
Yeah, it's almost like the overall island environment that you're trying to market rather than focused on one particular sector, saying we're the best for this.
Absolutely.
But I absolutely agree. I think it's really important for, and to recognise as well that the response from government, from local government through this crisis it was fantastic. I think it was really, really good, and the result of that, where we're seeing a lot of that now, and obviously everything. If we look across to the UK, where everyone's sort of in a much different position than we are, we're all sort of back in the office, or we can be back in the office, and it's fantastic. And I think if that's communicated effectively, and we can capitalise on that and combine that with the message now, but people are looking towards the Isle of Man to see, okay, well, what's the differences between where I am and the Isle of Man? And you said you combine that with the sort of the low crime rate and everything else that comes with it. It becomes an attractive place to move your family to move your business to, and if that's communicated effectively, I think it's it could really hold us in good stead.
And you touched earlier, Mark, on maybe the amount of supply that might be there to meet demand. Yep. Do you think there's the right kind of either commercial and perhaps residential assets that are either there or could be brought to being in purpose through a level of redevelopment, perhaps?
Absolutely. Again, if we take the office sector as sort of a barometer, because it is key to the island, and it's always been seen as a sort of barometer of success. If you see tower cranes in a city centre, it's doing well. And I think that the Isle of Man, if we could attract the right businesses, they will react. Buildings will be built. There is probably 1 million square feet that we could have built in Douglas Town Centre over the next 4 or 5 years if we wanted to, and the demand was there. So the provision of accommodation isn't a problem. Maybe there is a 24, 36 month timeline in terms of it coming through. Yeah. But within Tevir Group, I'm sure Ciaran will confirm, the likes of the Villiers scheme can produce 75,000 square feet within the next couple of years. And we're some of the best space in the island.
Mm-hmm. That's it. And I think, again, it's sort of backward looking, and of course a lot of it was sort of pre the crisis, but obviously there's development on Athol Street, where our occupancy rate now is above 90%, in taking in sort of the terms that we have agreed. So we only completed that. What was that completed? It was September last year.
Yeah. Well, we only started marketing then, but real completion was November by the time they got off site. Yeah.
So it's I think that demonstrates. No, there's an element of that which are not new entrants as such and people moving around the market, but there's still
Is that demand though for the right type of asset, perhaps that sort
Well,
of
that's
differentiated, higher quality piece that, like you say, hopefully will meet the demands of somebody that's.
I think that's key to it, and that's where about looking forward is what's going to be different post-COVID to pre-COVID. And I think what you really see is it's not so much that things are going to be totally different. What you will see post-COVID is an acceleration of changes that were already happening.
Sure.
So if you took the office market, there was already flexible working, there was hot desking going on. You could have gone to Zurich and they would have hot desking going on at the moment. So yes, there's changes, but I think those changes will be accelerated. Yeah, you'll see companies who are again far more concerned about ESG, environmental impact, social health of their staff, working in the right environment. And I said, next door at 55 Athol Street is a perfect example. I've just been in there now. You've got a fantastic reception facility where people can go and sit and relax and get out of the office. You've got a gym on site. You've got showers on site. You've got bike stores. This is what you should see in the next phase of development and in the changes that will happen post-COVID. You may well see densities changing. So densities may people may want to work to 200 square foot a person rather than 50 square foot a person. They may want greater collaboration space, greater communal space. So it's quite interesting, the different arguments in the property press at the moment as to whether it will mean companies who may actually have more people working from home actually still require more space.
Sure, it's that extra flexibility within the actual property itself. So like you say, maybe not everybody is filling all of the space all at one time, but it's using that space in a different way to get the best out of your employees, basically. Very interesting. And maybe touching on retail or hospitality sectors, how do you think those?
Yeah, so retail is obviously quite a contrast to the office market. If you just look at the flip side of the current crisis, then the leisure, as we would call it, including hospitality and retail, other side are the areas that have suffered the most. Retail on the island probably slightly different to the UK. I mean, I deal with quite a lot of UK property as well, and retail has been decimated. High street retail in the UK has been decimated, and a lot of that's been press-driven, property press-driven, because like many of these things, it's not like it's going to disappear. There is still going to be a high street, there's still going to be retail business. It may be very different to what it was before, and there may be a recalibration in terms of rents and commitments that people are taking, but people will still want that sort of social experience and leisure experience of walking down a high street, walking around a shopping centre. They may change the way they evolve in terms of their actual physical layout as well, to allow for different thinking. But I think they'll continue. It's quite interesting. I was reading an article by Next, who obviously have been one of the major sort of fashion companies to embrace both internet sales. That they started off on so many different fronts, and they actually I think confirmed that where they have a high street presence in a town, that drives their online sales to the extent.
But complete the transaction elsewhere, basically.
Absolutely, but in terms of figures, it was like 117% higher turnover in a town where they have a physical presence than one that they don't. So I think that's really interesting. And I said I don't see the end of the high street, but there's certainly going to be significant changes, and you will see vacancy even in Strand Street. So Strand Street will see vacancy. There will be casualties, and that will still continue, because possibly the harder quarter for retail may be this quarter more so than last quarter. As some of them run out of funds, as CVAs appear. What's quite interesting is quite often when we've had CVAs or we've had re-gears in Strand Street, the Isle of Man sites for these multinational companies have been some of the best sites that they have. So they've been quite keen to stay in occupation. So that's positive.
And how will that maybe interact then with some of those older items of sort of stock, like you say, maybe in Strand Street? Do you think that there'll be an element there of sort of consolidation? Maybe some of the units becoming bigger or reconfigured.
I think more so than necessarily consolidation. I mean, you are seeing redevelopment even in Duke Street at the moment. The old KFC site is down. I think that it will be more a rebasing of rents. That landlords will need to be sensible, and we've seen that in other towns in the island. Ramsey no longer has any particular presence of multinational type tenants, but the shops are pretty well full. And I think you've seen a change there with landlords being sensible, getting tenants. Bums on seats, the key thing. And retail in the Isle of Man can function much better than the UK because we don't have the problem of a penal business rates system, where you're paying almost as much in rates as you are in rent.
So it's about being not anchored to the past and looking to what will be the next trend, basically. And what do you think those any other key sort of future trends might be? I don't know, Ciaran, from your perspective.
I think it's difficult. It's difficult. It just feels like a difficult point in time to be sort of establishing that at the moment. Even as Mark was sort of talking there about the sort of impact on retail and whether it be in the Isle of Man or in the UK. Again, if we just look at the timing of this, our borders closed on the 25th of March, which was the traditional sort of rent quarter day. So, a lot of landlords perhaps would have seen themselves, okay, well, I maybe got my rent, or there's still so much uncertainty around that point. And now
it's waiting almost for this next
quarter day
phase, because like you say, maybe they had their sort of the money in their pocket almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas now it's the case where the cash hasn't been in the tills for the last quarter. Yeah. What happens next?
And then you combine that with, you said there's that pent up frustration. There's people have been sat at home, and where that non-essential retail hasn't been open, all of a sudden it is open. Maybe there's a little bit of a sugar rush, and that sort of feels good to turn over for retail. But in reality, then as you said, you see how it settles. So I think it'll be more towards the end of the year, and we'll sort of start to feel that a little bit more. But I think Mark's absolutely right. It's going to require, particularly on the retail side and the industrial side, it's going to require landlords to work a lot more collaboratively with their tenants. It's a lot easier to keep a tenant in place than it is to find a new tenant. So I think that's going to require a lot of work. I think it's slightly different in the sort of commercial office space at the moment, but as you said, I think it will change from what the core office space is used, and maybe when looking forward and thinking about trends, I think when you're looking at incoming tenants in the future, I think a lot of it will be around flexibility, as you said. If you have that core space, and whether that be for more accommodating more people working from home, or perhaps in the future you feel, okay, well, perhaps we may need more space, we may need that sort of flexibility and that sort of that ability to sort of shift the tenure slightly. I think we'll probably see some of that creeping into lease agreements. But
interesting. So an awful lot of my lockdown time has been spent negotiating between landlords and tenants in terms of support from landlords. Ironically, landlords are the one group that probably have received very little support from anybody all the way through, but they're still looked at as being people who tenants look to support in difficult times like this. And it's been very interesting. So in the office sector, not a great deal's happened. Sometimes it's been more of a negotiation to take out a break option in order to give them maybe a quarter rent free and a bit of an improvement in cash flow. But outside of the office sector, in the retail and leisure industries, the reaction of landlords to tenant requests has been quite interesting to see. And probably in the main, you've seen sensible attitudes. A sensible landlord and a decent tenant. We've been able to come to a solution quite easily and quite straightforward. And sometimes that solution has had to go now on to a second quarter. But, Ciaran's absolutely right. What you don't want to do is to lose a tenant, because if you've lost your tenant and then you've got 6 months to find a new one, and you give them 6 months rent free to get in, you're better taking a bit of pain now and keeping bums on seats. But in the UK, where I've seen a lot of other activity, it's been quite unpleasant. You've seen landlords who are throwing summonses at tenants within hours almost of rent not being paid. And you've seen other tenants pleading poverty when they can easily afford to pay the rent, and when maybe their revenues and their profits have actually increased during the period, but they've jumped on the bandwagon. So there's been a lot of interesting negotiations out there, which are still ongoing now. And as I say, I expect to see right through the next quarter and maybe longer.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's the really important point. It's down to landlords to work with their tenants, and it's that sort of transparency and that open relationship, as you said. Where the industrial sector, when you look at that across, it covers an awful lot. It covers, broadly. You go into an industrial estate, you've got everything from a gym to sort of heavy manufacturing. And as you said, now the sort of if you're the landlord of that industrial tenant, you might say, look, the gym's being shuttered, the guys, yeah, no doubt they're struggling. I'm going to have to work with them. But then down the road, you may also have someone who's could be producing sort of disinfectant spray. You know, as you said, it's been a gold rush for them guys. Well, yeah, you're not going to.
It's understanding what is the impact and therefore what's the appropriate trade-off for that.
That's it. And I think, and it does require a sort of a business-to-business approach. I think from landlords, and it requires a sort of a fair view as well from the tenants to say, look, I'm not just going to say, yeah, I can't afford to pay my rent, because maybe in the UK they're protected slightly with the sort of Chancellor's changes, if you like. But but as I said, it's slightly different here in the island. So, but it does require just that collaboration, and I think that's actually a positive that we'll see going forward as well, is that sort of closer interaction perhaps between tenants and landlords.
But you also made some negatives in that you may well see that one of the key things from, say, my business's point of view for Black Race Cowley has been the government support available in the island, which has been crucial to us paying our bills and keeping going through these last 3 months, and now it's been extended for the 6 months. And I know I can't stress enough how important that's been for our business, and therefore I assume being crucially important for many other businesses on the island as well. When that stops, and when the limitations on, say, landlords looking for forfeiture on tenant leases where they haven't paid rent, there may well be some interesting discussions to be had and some change over the rest of this year. I don't think it'll be as serious over here, but it will happen, and there will be more unemployment, so there will be more tenants that will disappear and go out of business.
And perhaps lastly, for both of you, what does the new reality mean for you and your business?
Actually, it's quite interesting. I mean, I'm older than both of you guys, unfortunately, but when I started work in the property industry, we had a practice where you did everything. So the sales details were typed. We took a Polaroid picture of a property and photocopied it in order to put it out there, and we put up the boards ourselves with a big mallet hammer in the back of the car. So it was a slightly different world. We've already had to embrace enormous change in terms of the property agency industry and as chartered surveyors. And that's been hard and it's been expensive, but if we hadn't done it, we wouldn't survive. And now we have the next phase of that again, which will involve far more virtual meetings. It will involve a lot more Zoom, Teams, Google Hangouts and every other type of meeting you can have, which actually we've now embraced and actually enjoy, and it's very much a daily part of life. We have had one call already this morning.
It's the march of technology-enabled businesses.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, my big wish is, as we touched on before, is that government and Department of Enterprise really take advantage of this situation, because it'll only be here for a certain period of time that we have the limelight, and they get out and sell the Isle of Man. Because what I want to do for the next 10 years is to see an influx of people and business that will make this island very successful.
But I think as you said, similar to Mark, we were sort of set up, I guess, in terms of our technology in the office. It's relatively straightforward for us to we work mobile, if you like, and it was relatively straightforward for us to pick up and work from home. But what has been noticeable is, perhaps some of our suppliers and different people, as you said, that embracing of technology has made a big difference, I think, to us and very much to them. And I think that's been really good. And in terms of what does a new reality mean? I think it's I don't think it's going to be wildly different for us as an organisation. Perhaps we'll need to sort of consider flexibility in the future, continue to sort of embrace that technology, and I think that'll be everything.
Well, thanks, Ed, Mark and Ciaran, for your views. I mean, really just to touch on, I think something Mark had said there, really, and I think I may have mentioned last week, I think what Mark mentioned around the trend and the interest in the Isle of Man, we've certainly seen it, and as I've talked about before, the web traffic going to sort of the key sort of 3 or 4 pages from us around why the Isle of Man, tax rates in the Isle of Man, is almost actually double the amount of web traffic for all of our other pages, including our COVID support materials. So it really does show that the wave of interest in the Isle of Man, and in particular, obviously, when we managed to just about pip Guernsey publicly to be COVID free, which I joked about with our Guernsey colleagues who feel that we cheated on that one. But professional services firms, government are all talking about this influx of interest through, I guess, in part, the locate.im campaign. I mean, David, from a tax perspective, what does someone need to consider when they are looking at relocating from both, I guess, an individual's perspective, but also from moving their business over to the island?
Yeah, it's interesting as a tax advisor, having business owners and entrepreneurs relocating here is perfect. It's the sweet spot, really, because it enables people to set up their affairs in a tax efficient manner that works for them, in a manner that works for their business, and in a manner that works for the Isle of Man's economy as a whole. So I mean, it's great news that there is such interest in people relocating here. In terms of people relocating here, people often worry about becoming resident in the Isle of Man and what do they need to do. And the truth is, if somebody is genuinely moving here and settling their home here, then almost certainly they will become Isle of Man resident. And the key is making sure that you cease to be resident in the jurisdiction that you are leaving. And obviously the key jurisdiction, or the most common jurisdiction for people to relocate here to, is from the UK. And it's interesting that from 6th of April 19, we've got a new double tax treaty with the UK, which can be particularly helpful for people in that transitional period where they might otherwise end up being dual residents as they spend some time in the UK and some time in the Isle of Man. So that can be particularly helpful, the tiebreaker clause in there. It's worth saying that if somebody thinks they're going to relocate to the Isle of Man and have the intention of moving here, but only spend 20 or 30 days a year here in different hotels, that's not relocating to the Isle of Man. That's not going to make somebody Isle of Man resident. But for people who have genuine intent and carry that through, then it's great news for the island. If we look at people moving their business to the island, then obviously there's a multitude of different tax consequences you need to think about, and it will depend upon where their business activity is currently carried on from, the legal entity through which it's carried on, the value of the business, worrying about exit charges if you're transferring value out of an existing non-Isle of Man company into an Isle of Man company. You then need to think about, going forward, are all of your business operations going to be carried on from the island, or are you going to continue to have a footprint in another jurisdiction such as the UK? And that footprint might be people or premises and so on. And I guess in the context of increasing numbers of technology-based businesses, it sort of becomes easier and easier to relocate your business to the island from that perspective. But I would say, watch out for the island substance legislation and consider that as an early stage to make sure that you won't trip up on anything in that regard. But overall, I'd say, having this interest in people relocating here is just overall extremely positive for us all.
Yeah, and I think a slight twist on it. I mean, we've also seen the interest is where people have enjoyed working from home, have actually seen that potentially there is just a very different way of structuring their home lives. So, potentially working from the Isle of Man, but still working for their UK employer. Clearly, the air links, which are a little in turmoil, I think it's fair to say, in the Isle of Man. Everyone needs to remember that Flybe just isn't there anymore. So actually, even when things are back to normal and flight routes continue, actually Flybe is just not going to be there, which will leave a big gap, I think. Hopefully filled to some extent by Logan Air. But clearly, those air links are going to be important if someone decides they want to live in the Isle of Man, but continue to work from a UK company. And again, what is it a similar point, or what should they be thinking about if they want to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect there's probably been quite a number of people that have been spending extended amounts of time working in the Isle of Man, but continuing to work for UK employers. But going forward, as you start to think about that on a longer term basis, you do need to make sure that you get that right. So, and in particular, if you're Isle of Man resident, Isle of Man based, working for a UK employer, your UK employer is going to want to think carefully about its payroll tax obligations. Essentially, if you perform all of your duties in the Isle of Man and none in the UK for a UK company, then you'll be into purely Isle of Man obligations, essentially. So Isle of Man personal taxation, Isle of Man payroll obligations. If you spend most of your time in the Isle of Man, but some of your time in the UK, then if you're working for a UK employer, then broadly speaking, the tax treaty won't protect you. So you could still have a UK tax exposure on part of your income, even though you're not UK resident. So depending on circumstances, you might want to structure it or persuade your employer to establish an Isle of Man company that you then work for, and particularly if significant sums are involved. And then it's more easy to be treaty protected from UK tax if you do want to take some employment duties in the UK. Yeah. But overall, it can be very positive and tax efficient for all parties to have employees working remotely from the island.
Great, thank you, David. It's interesting as I look at my screen now. There's a London listed property company called Into, who many will recognise the name of that with its historic connections with Peel Holdings, and of course its ownership of the Trafford Centre. Certainly the stock markets today don't seem particularly positive about retail rental receipts. The Into is down another 10% today, and is probably down about 90% since the beginning of the year. So it'll be interesting to see where that plays out later today, which sort of brings me on to next week's webinar. Next week we'll be joined by Rebecca from Nedbank, focusing very much on investment markets and what trends we expect to see there going forward. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the stock market with I guess the rude awakening that perhaps retail is in not the shape that people even predicted. But thank you all to all my guests and my teammates who've taken the time to be part of the webinar this morning, and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar and slides will be available this afternoon by visiting kpmg.co.im/webinars. For those that were unable to make last week, it is also available on our on-demand portal. If you have any questions, and thank you for those questions that did come in today, hopefully they've been answered. If you didn't quite get the answer you were looking for, please do feel free to follow up with us by email. But don't hesitate to contact us. Generally, the details are on the screen. And I trust you have a great rest of the week. Hopefully enjoy some of the sunshine. I believe we're getting today and tomorrow. And we'll see you next week, same time, same place. Thank you.